Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Azren, the language nerd here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to today's podcast episode, and of course, YouTube video. Now, today we're gonna do something a little bit different. As you can tell, you can see my screen right now. You can see it on YouTube, and if you're watching this on, or rather, if you're listening to this on the podcast, on a podcasting platform, hopefully the podcasting platform you use supports video. For example, on Spotify, I know video is supported. And so if you can, it will be helpful for you to watch or consume, rather, this podcast episode with the video because I'm going to be using some visuals. If you are driving or you're exercising, working out, something like that, and you're just listening, you'll still be able to find it helpful. But when you get home, when you have a chance to get in front of a computer, visit my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search Azren, the language nerd, and go watch the video version of this. You'll see some of the visuals, and it will help you. It'll really help bring to life what we talk about today. So right now, as you can see on my screen, for those who are watching the video, you are seeing the topic for today, which is conversation maps and social scripts. I have used social scripts in particular, but even conversational maps for a long time. And they've helped me when it comes to speaking languages tremendously. However, it's only recently that I've, I suppose, learned the words or found the words to explain what I've done for years now in a way that makes sense to someone who doesn't use conversation maps and social scripts. I do have to give some credit to an individual named Andrew Bustamante. Andrew Bustamante, he was talking about some conversation maps in a very different context in some online content that he had made. And that's one of the things that helped me find the words to describe and explain, well, what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, what is a conversation map? So a conversation map is a visual tool that helps people navigate social interactions. They're similar to social scripts. Social scripts and conversation maps are a little bit different, in my view anyway, but they're similar enough. Conversation maps provide a structured framework for a conversation, breaking the conversation down into individual steps. Conversation maps have a wide variety of uses, such as having more seamless conversations in another language, supporting individuals who have social anxiety, getting a promotion at work, navigating a difficult conversation with someone that you care about. This could be a friend, it could be someone who works for you in the workplace, it could be a significant other. In terms of how they help language learners speak more fluently, because this is obviously a language learning podcast, it'll help you feel more confident when conversing in your target language. It'll help you structure your social interactions when you're speaking to someone in another language. It'll prompt and remind you of what you should be saying in a conversation, because people do freeze up. It's pretty common. So it'll help, I think, reduce some of that freezing up. And my personal favorite, it will reduce the necessity of understanding everything that the other person says. Because when you're learning a language, unless you have a very, very high degree of proficiency, you're not going to understand everything someone says to you. There's just too many words you don't know. And in a conversation, there are going to be things that happen, or rather the person's going to say things and you're going to not catch every word. In fact, if you're really on the beginner side of things, or maybe the person you're talking to has an accent you're unfamiliar with, listen, there's going to be a very high percentage of words that you don't understand. When you use a conversation map, it can actually help you communicate at a higher level than what your level currently is. For example, if you have a upper beginner level, if you use conversation maps, what can happen is you can come across as someone who has a low intermediate or mid intermediate level. You can do that, which is really cool. There are some keys for success when you're using conversation maps, and obviously I will explain to you what they are and how to make them. Don't worry, we're getting there. But there are some keys to success we should talk about first. Key number one is, in a conversation, it's important that you are the one asking most of the questions. You want to be asking most of the questions. The reality is, if you are on the receiving end of most questions and not on the asking end of the question, what will happen is that the reality is you won't be able to control what questions you are asked. It's difficult to control that. You are far more in control of the questions you ask, and you can make sure you're asking certain questions that lead the conversation in directions where you are comfortable or where you are able to actually reply. You can make sure you are the one asking things that you know about. You have the words to actually talk about, for example. It gives you some control of the conversation. Hope that makes sense. A second key for success, and this is a key for success when you're having conversations in another language in general, is you need to listen for the gist. Listen for the gist. I see far too many language learners who don't listen for the gist. They try to understand every word that someone is saying to them. But the reality is, unless you have a very high degree of proficiency, or if you're very familiar with the topic being discussed, you're not going to understand everything. No matter how hard you try, you're not going to understand everything that the other person says. And so in a general rule of thumb, when you're having conversations in the wild, in the real world, with native speakers who are not, for example, a teacher or someone who's trying to help you learn, you need to listen for the gist to give yourself the best chance of having that conversation go smoothly. The third key for success is understanding conversational probability. What is conversational probability? Well, I'll demonstrate that a little bit further in a moment, but here's a quick example. If you ask someone, how are you in English? If you ask someone, hey, how's it going? In English, I specify in English, there is a very high conversational probability that the person is going to say good and you, or some version of good and you. It might be great and you. It might be, hey, I'm doing all right. You. Some version of I'm doing good and you is highly probable. So that's going to come into when we talk about how to build a conversation map. I'm going to show you what one looks like on the video screen here for those of you watching the video. Understanding that will help you tremendously when you're making your conversation maps. Okay. And then the last key for success here is test and edit your maps. So once you've built a conversation map, which you can then start to use, and you probably will use it once you build one, it'll be very helpful, I think. You'll want to test and edit it. What that means is when you use your conversation map in a real life conversation, you'll start to realize that there are certain things that you didn't plan for accordingly. There are certain mistakes you made in your conversation map based on how the conversation unravels. And that will give you, what you'll then be able to do is go home, edit your map so that the next time you're in that conversation, you are perhaps more prepared. Okay. A few more things before I actually show you a conversation map, before I actually build one out with you and we go deeper into that. There are a few more things. A conversation map is going to help you prepare for a conversation that you're going to have so that basically no matter what the other person says, you're going to be able to reply seamlessly. But sometimes the other person is going to say something that you didn't prep for accordingly. You didn't plan for it. So what do you do if the person goes, quote unquote, off script? Quote unquote, they go off the map. Well, your best bet is to first say some variant of I don't understand. Try to have them repeat themselves. You listen carefully. Try to see if you get it the second time. You might use an online translator to figure out what they're saying. If after multiple attempts to figure out what they're saying and they try multiple times to explain it to you what they were saying, you're both not understanding each other, inevitably the other person is going to stop trying to explain it to you, and you're probably going to quit as well. It's very frustrating as a listener having someone try to explain something to you multiple times and you just don't get it. It's very frustrating. So that's likely going to lead to a lull in the conversation. It's going to lead to perhaps even an awkward pause. If that happens, you're going to redirect the conversation to another conversation map. Okay. And again, I will explain. I know we're building up to these maps. You're probably thinking, what the heck is a map? What's he talking about? Don't worry, we're going to get there in a moment. Okay. The last thing is if the person goes off the map, off the script, you may want to go and edit your conversation map later that day, because that might potentially be an indication, potentially, not for certain, not for sure, but possibly that's an indication that your map has some work and there's some work you have to do on your map. Okay. Last thing before we look at an actual map here, should you use a social script or should you use a conversation map for every conversation you ever have? No, probably not. Conversation maps are best for situations where you feel particularly nervous or anxious. It could be because, hey, listen, talking in another language makes you nervous or anxious. It could also be because you're going to have a conversation and you know that there's topics that are probably going to come up and you don't have the language to talk about those topics. That's also a time where you might be able to use it. They're also great for if it's very important for the conversation to go smoothly. It's important and you need it to go smoothly, so you can really use the conversation map to prepare for it best you can. And of course, a conversation map is used for when you have the luxury of planning in advance for the conversation. If you can't plan for the conversation in advance, you can't really build a conversation map in advance, obviously. However, I will say this, which is interesting. Once you get used to the process of building a conversation map, what's cool is when you find, at least for me, my personal experiences, when I find myself in situations where I'm talking to someone and we enter territory, we start talking about a topic that maybe I'm not familiar with or I'm struggling to really stay in the conversation, I can start making the map in my head on the spot. And for years, often that's what I've done until I came across Andrew Bustamante's work and I saw him talk about using conversation maps in a professional setting, in a soft skills setting, in a workplace. Until I saw him talk about it there, I thought to myself, oh, wait a second. I've done this for years. I did it in my head. I would do it in a very unorganized way, not in a very visual way on paper, right? But oh my God, now I have the words to explain what I've been doing and I can do it in a much more efficient way. This is so helpful. Now I can explain to other people. Yes, great. So once you get used to the process, you can even start to sort of do it on the spot in a sense. And that's really, really helpful. And the last thing here before we jump into, last two things actually, before we jump into the map is, remember that conversation maps, they should be as detailed as is practical. So imagine preparing for a conversation. If you're preparing for a big job interview or something like that, it would take you forever, an infinite amount of time, maybe not infinite, but it would take a very long time to prepare for every single situation that might arise in that interview. It might take you 10 hours or more than that even. And as we build conversation maps, you'll also notice very quickly that in conversation maps, you can also really make the conversation map as in-depth as you want, essentially. But there's a point where, at least in my personal experience, there's a point where it's getting too detailed and you need to stop. You need to make it as detailed as is practical. Okay, which you'll see in a moment what I mean by that. Okay. If you're looking at my screen, you'll notice I've written social script on my screen. In case you've never heard that term, they're very similar to conversation maps. They're very similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're really similar in my view anyway. A social script would be, I'll give you a very simple social script. A very simple social script might be when you're walking out of a grocery store and you have your bags of groceries and you're going to pay for the food that you bought, right? The person, at least in my city, the way it works when you get to the cashier is they go, "Hi, did you find everything okay?" And there's only one real answer. The answer is, yeah, I got everything. They'll say, okay, great. Right? That was a little mini social script. Every time you get to the cashier, they're always going to say some version of, hey, did you find everything okay? And you're going to say some version of, yeah, no problem at all. That's like a very simple social script. Conversation maps are social scripts in a sense, but they go a little bit deeper. Okay, let's look at a conversation map. So you've been building up to this for a long time. Let's talk about it. what we're looking at here is a conversation map for the question, what's new? So if you see someone, you haven't seen them in a while, and you're like, hey, what's new? What's new in your life? How are things going? Right? That's what the conversation map we're going to build. Now, or not what's new, excuse me, wrong question. I'm sorry. It's how, it's, sorry, not what's new. I mistyped that. It's how was your week? Sorry, not what's new. How was your week? That's the question. Made a mistake there. Sorry, guys. The question we're going to base this conversation map on is the question, how was your week? If you're only listening to this, what I'm sharing on my screen right now is essentially looks like a mind map. If you guys have seen the mind maps with the circles and the branches that stem off from a circle, that's kind of what I've got shared on the screen here. So one very common answer to how was your week was something like pretty good, right? People might say, oh, I had a good week. Yeah, it was pretty good. It was all right. It was, they'll say some version of it, it was good. That's a very typical answer, right? So as you can see on my screen, I put a little box here that says pretty good. That's in blue. So everything in purple on my screen is a question, is what you would say. Everything in blue is what the other person you're talking to would say. So you know in advance, you're going to see someone, you're going to ask them, how was your week? You know in advance that using conversational probability, at least in English, right? When you ask someone, how was your week? An English speaker very likely is going to say some version of pretty good or very good or good, some version of that, right? They might even say good and you, and then you're going to say it was good as well. Now, you know this already in advance. So then you already know when you ask someone, hey, how was your week? You know they're going to say good. You can now go one branch down. You can now prepare and you can say, well, I'm going to then say, what did you do? That's your next question. Remember, when you are pairing these conversation maps, you want to be the one asking most of the questions. Not all the questions. It's okay to answer some yourself, and you're going to see that pop up in the map, but you want to be the one doing most of the question asking. So you're going to ask then, you might ask, well, what did you do? Now, if you look on my screen, you're going to see different branches. They might say, not much. How about you? So you ask them, what did you do? And they say, yeah, I don't know, not too much. Normal week. I don't know. Yeah, just not very much. People say that. So that's a possible answer. They might tell you something about work. They might say, oh my God, work was so busy. They might say, oh yeah, I worked a lot. Oh yeah, just a pretty typical work day. They might say something related to work. They might give you a fun story, as you can see on my screen. They got married. They bought a car. They, who knows? They went on vacation. They just got back. They might share something related to hobbies. Maybe they share something related to family, right? So these are some very, again, we're using conversational probability, right? This probability, as I said, is important to predict what buckets of conversation people are going to reply with. What category will the reply fit into? So if someone starts to share a story about work, it actually, in a sense, if you use a conversation map, in a way, it's not going to matter if you understood everything they said. It's not exactly going to matter because you know what bucket you're in and you've prepared for that bucket. You've prepared for that category. So let's give one example. So let's say the person says, you said, hey, what did you do last week? And they said, not really that much, or can't really remember, or it was a typical week. Some variation of, they don't give you much information, and then they put the question back to you. Yeah, not very much. How about you? Right? We know this might happen. So then we go down our tree, and we have another purple box here. Right? I might have said, if you asked me this week, I would have said something like, I have family here from the UK. Oh, I have some family visiting. This then branches off into some different questions they might ask you. And again, these are all, we can use statistical probability to figure, conversational probability to figure out where this goes. If I said I have family here from the UK, they might say, who's visiting? Oh, who's here? They might say, oh, what'd you do with your family? What did you guys do? They're probably going to ask, why are they visiting? That's a very probable question. They might say some variation of, how was it? Oh, how was how's your time with your family? You know this is probably coming. You know they're going to ask that. So then you can prepare some very simple answers. You can say, if we look at who's visiting, we can scroll down and I might say some aunts and uncles. I've written this map as if I'm a very beginner speaker and not a very, very advanced speaker. If you're more advanced, you probably wouldn't prepare a conversation map for the question, how was your week? Because you're more advanced. So you can just do that in your sleep. It's not that hard for you. You can just sort of do it. But if you're a very beginner, answering the question, how was your week? And like having that 5-minute conversation is difficult. So you might prepare, some aunts and uncles. If they asked you, what'd you do? You might say, we had lots of family dinners and hung out together. If they said, why are they visiting? You might say, we had a family function. How was it? How was it? How was your time with them? You might say, it was really fun. I haven't seen my extended family in years. Now, remember, when we have a conversation map, you want to be the one asking most questions as much as possible. It allows you to be in control of the conversation. And so what you want to try and do when you build out a map is, I'm going to zoom out a bit for those watching the video screen. You'll notice here, I'll circle them. You won't be able to see the text, but you'll see the map here. Okay, I'm going to circle. When they ask you, when they ask you a follow-up question about your family who's visiting in town, you'll notice all of these bubbles, all the possible answers I give, right? I've circled all 4. You'll notice I've tied them all back to the same question. You see that here? They've all tied back to the same question. So you know that when they ask you about your family who's visiting from the UK, they're going to ask you some question, right? No matter what your answer is, you're going to give an answer. And then immediately after your answer, you're going to ask a new follow-up question. And you only need to memorize one. There's no right or wrong answer to what the question is, but you want to keep it simple. So one question I might have asked if I was in the situation was something like, where does your family live? Or do you have family who lives out of town? Is your family all here? I would ask some question related to where their family lives. It makes sense in that conversation. It's a very logical question. Nothing wrong with that. And that puts me back in the shoes of the question asker. And then you can build this tree out. You keep building it out, keep building it out. We scroll over here, right? You'll notice, actually I haven't even done it, but we go all the way back to the top to the question, how was your week? That's what you started the whole conversation with. I built a tree for pretty good. The answer, pretty good, right? But they might say something a little different. They might say, oh my God, it was a catastrophe. Oh, it was awful. Oh my God. Some negative reply. Well, no problem. You just create a separate branch, as I'm literally doing on the screen right now. You create a separate branch for what you would say if they give some kind of negative response, right? They're complaining, right? Or a negative response. Nah, I'm just typing on my screen for those who don't have the YouTube video up on them, right? You can build a new tree for a negative response. So this takes some time. It's not an instant process. It's not something that takes 5 minutes. But if we go back to our document here, remember, you don't need to use this for every conversation that's excessive. It's only in situations where you feel really nervous and you want to be prepared, right? It's important for the conversation to go very smoothly, right? You know the conversation's coming and you're like, I want to plan for this properly, right? You know they're going to say things that you just don't understand, right? You know that. And you're like, man, I want to make sure that this still goes smoothly. Also remember that, where to go? Here it is. Remember that you just need to make it go as detailed as is practical. You don't need to make it infinitely long. It's okay. It can be relatively small. It's okay. I'm going to stop my screen share here. It's going to be a little blurry on my face and kind of dark. My lighting's not so great, but let me just stop my screen share. Sorry for those watching the video. I know it's kind of grainy and dark. I know I haven't got great lighting today. And yeah, I knew you wouldn't see my face while sharing my screen most of the time. But anyway, I'm going to be traveling next month and I'm going to be building a conversation map. I'll be traveling and staying with a family that I've stayed with in the past. I'm friends with them. And they're Mandarin speaking people. Now, I know that when I go there, that they're going to ask me certain questions in Mandarin. I know that there's certain topics we're going to talk about, and I know there's certain things I want to ask them. So I know there's things I want to ask them. I know there's things they're going to ask me, and I know there's topics in general we're going to discuss. And I want those conversations to go smoothly. Like, listen, like I know I'm going to want to ask them, like, what's been going on in your lives for the past 3 years? I know I want, or what has been more than 3 years now. I haven't seen them in, yeah, whatever it's been, 4 years, 4 years now. It's been 4 years. I know I'm going to ask that question, right? I know they're going to ask me what's new with me, right? And because I know that, I can now prepare for it, right? And I know they're going to ask me about my work, my teaching, my business. I can prepare for that. I know they're going to ask me about, God, like they're going to ask me about my other travels. Where have I been? Right? I know they're probably going to ask me about, at some point, maybe not immediately upon arrival, we're probably going to talk about the economy of Canada and the economy of Taiwan, like what's going on with the government and just with what do you call that? With economical and political affairs. Like that probably will just come up at some point. Like that'll be something we talk about at some point or another. I know that's going to come. So I'm going to build out these conversational maps, right? Knowing that I probably want to be on the question asking end most of the time because it allows me to have more control over the conversation. But knowing that they're going to ask me questions too, and me planning that, okay, when they ask me about how are things in Canada economically, I'll have some answer prepared, right? So they get their answer, but I also want to be able to relatively quickly, in order to maintain a smooth conversation, ask them something so that we can keep it within my level of competence. Does that make sense? Now, last thing I'll say to wrap this up, I know it's a longer episode. You might be thinking, well, Azren, you're almost manipulating the conversation like that. That feels like it feels so controlled. It feels so like, which is true, right? And I'll also say that frequently I'm not going to use conversation maps. I'm only going to make them as detailed as as detailed as they need to be practical for me. So for example, like I'm genuinely curious about a number of things about my host family's life. And I actually probably want the conversation to go wherever they want to take it. Like they might want to share something that there's no way I could ever prepare for. There's just no way for me to do it because I don't know I can't predict everything. And it's okay for me to let it go in that direction and then stumble into words or phrases I don't understand and then have to use a translator and figure it out. That's actually healthy and helps you grow, and it's very good. So I'm not saying that every conversation needs to be highly controlled by you so it's always in your comfort zone, but this is one tool you can use to give yourself, it's one tool you can use to help you control where a conversation goes when it's important for you to do so, when you're highly anxious about something, when you're very nervous about something, when you know you're going to have a difficult conversation. Like I know when I land and I first see the family, like I'm going to have this long flight. I know it's a long train ride to their apartment. Like I know I'm going to be so tired, and I'm going to definitely rely on a conversation map for that initial conversation, like 100%. Because I'll be so tired that I just want a smooth conversation. Yes, it's going to be something that I dictate the pace of. I'm going to kind of make it go in certain places, but that's because I'm going to be so tired. And that's probably going to be the best thing for that initial 5-minute conversation, right? So anyway, I hope you guys found that helpful. If you have any questions about this, I know it's a topic you maybe haven't heard about before, and it's not something that I've seen talked about before. I even looked up like conversation maps, that term, and I don't even really see a lot about it, to be honest, on YouTube and such. So if you have any questions, any comments, things like that, feel free to ask. I'm happy to discuss further. You can visit azrenthelanguagenerd.com/contact if you want to reach me on any social media platform or by email. So that's AZREN thelanguagenerd.com/contact. And you can reach me there. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll chat later. Bye-bye. See you.